Senator Elizabeth Warren has suspended her campaign to be the Democratic nominee for president, but we can't forget that at one point she was actually leading in national polls, briefly eclipsing Joe Biden after receiving quite a bit of positive media attention. So where did it all go wrong? Where did the fall actually happen? And joining us to break this down and more, Ryan Grim, Washington Bureau Chief for The Intercept. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back.
Glad to have you here. So look, I find the topic interesting no matter what, but I thought you had a great tweet earlier today where you highlighted what you found to be sort of three of the things that were particularly bad for Elizabeth Warren. So I wanted to talk about those with you. With the first being, you had some quotes from Pete Buttigieg about her lack of ability to explain how she was going to finance programs like Medicare for All, and that is, I think, popularly. That whole brouhaha is pointed to as one of the worst episodes for her. So give me your thoughts on that.
Right, so this was the mid-October debate, which is kind of the high point of her race. You know, she kind of surged to the top in mid to late September, got through that first debate as a front runner fairly unscathed, but it was that second one as a front runner where everybody really came after her. And the blow that landed the hardest was Pete Buttigieg saying, you know, Senator, it's a simple yes or no question. Are you going to raise taxes on the middle class? You have a plan for everything, but you don't have a plan for this. It's quite conspicuous. And because she had built this brand of, over the last 6 months, having a plan for everything, I have a plan for that, it was a devastating blow. It led to her coming out in the next few days with, you know, in the next week or so with a plan to pay for it, which then was followed by a transition plan. Everybody focuses on those latter two things as the thing that messed her up. But I think, you know, the pile on that happened at that debate was pretty brutal for her. And if you remember, shortly after the debate ended, and this is the second thing that I highlighted in my post, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez endorsed Bernie Sanders. You know, and so this was, you know, several weeks after he had been, you know, left for dead, you know, literally and figuratively. And here he comes out of the Las Vegas hospital, kind of surging back. And so those two things combined, you know, her beginning to fall and his rise really starts to hurt him. And then the third thing I highlighted was this November 4th New York Times Siena poll that came out. Elizabeth Warren, by having such a highly educated base, you know, was really reliant on kind of New York Times readers. You know, you live by the New York Times, you die by the New York Times. And they put out a poll November 4th that had her losing to Donald Trump in one of the three Rust Belt battleground states and tied with him in the others, while Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders were beating Trump in all three. And so for a lot of New York Times readers whose only priority was, you know, let's beat Donald Trump, you know, that was the beginning of the end for her. That, okay, well, we love Elizabeth Warren, but if she can't beat Donald Trump, according to the New York Times, which they revere above all others, then they went looking elsewhere. And that's when you start seeing Pete Buttigieg and in particular start to eat into her lead.
Yeah, and look, there's obviously been a lot of talk about electability through the course of this Democratic primary. My memory of 2016 has blurred a little bit, and obviously that was a different sort of race. I don't know if that's always such a big concern, but it feels like while everyone got hit at one point or another with, is this the person that can beat Donald Trump? It feels like she was hit the hardest. And you know, I wonder, is there anything that she could have done about that? I mean, she can't, you know, snap her fingers and change poll results, but if you have to convince people that you can beat him, how could she have gone about doing that?
So you probably couldn't completely get away from that problem. But the way that you convince people that you can win is by winning or by showing strong polling numbers. So the key decision that's going to be you know, looked at in her campaign was not to go on air in Iowa in particular in September and October when she was the front runner, and that was not a question of resources. She had the ability to go up and start blanketing Iowa with television ads, but she decided not to. Her advisors believed that ads like that only give you a sugar high, that studies show that 6 weeks later, nobody remembers, a single thing they saw in the ad, and all of the advantage that you got from that spending dissipates. And so they were aiming everything towards caucus day, a big field office, and then a big spend in January leading to the caucus. But what that failed to understand is that even though you're not voting in September and October, what people tell pollsters matters in the material world, because there's this dynamic interplay between voters' perception of your viability and electability and what the polls are showing. Yeah. It's kind of a chicken or an egg thing. And so if you can artificially prop up your polling, through this period where you're getting absolutely slaughtered, and then you come out on the other end still in the top tier, you can say, look, New York Times said I wasn't electable, but look, I just went through a month of fire, and here I am still number one in Iowa. She decided not to do that, and so her poll numbers dove, and that has its own dynamic effect. If your poll numbers are diving and people are saying that you're not electable, then those things feed each other as kind of reaffirming each other.
So I want to give a hypothetical to you. So I agree with all three of those incidents that you pointed out. I think that they obviously did hurt her. One thing that she definitely could not have changed, but in theory, if Bernie Sanders had not run, if he had decided to forego it, if instead perhaps he had supported Elizabeth Warren, like if he hadn't been there and Elizabeth Warren hadn't had to sort of try to carve out this very narrow lane for herself where she's differentiating herself from Sanders, but trying to appeal to some of the centrists too. Like if he hadn't been there, where do you think we'd be following Super Tuesday? Would she be the front runner right now?
Yeah, that is an interesting hypothetical, and it's actually the scenario that she envisioned when she got into the race at the end of 2018. She believed that Sanders was going to look at the numbers and decide that he was going to go off a statesman. He changed the party. He ran an incredible campaign in 2016. Her campaign often talks about Bernie Sanders having a ceiling. That's not just talk from them. Like they fundamentally believe that. Whether or not it's true, we'll find out in the rest of this campaign. But it's something that they genuinely believe. And so they thought, okay, well, Bernie probably knows he's got some ceiling. He's not going to run. And I think to answer your question, sure, she's a much more formidable opponent, in that scenario, because if through that September and October, or through that November doldrum where she's pushed down, into the teens, if she's also picking up the 10 or 20% that were backing Sanders around that time, all of a sudden she's back to 30, 35, and she's ahead of Joe Biden. A win in Iowa pushes her to into New Hampshire, and then with kind of if Sanders actually is rallying to her and helping her to organize in Nevada, it could be a different scenario, because she's more competitive with Joe Biden in these suburbs that were so decisive on Super Tuesday. The educated, wealthier Democratic voters who swung so wildly to Joe Biden, do have some affinity for her as well. They just had more on Super Tuesday. So yeah, I think you make a very interesting point. People will be doing what ifs forever, and that's an interesting one.
Yeah. Well, thank you for engaging with it. Ryan Grim, as always, thank you for joining us. You look like you're certainly busy today, so I hope we didn't take you off your schedule too much, but we always appreciate you joining the show.
No problem. Happy to do it.
Thank you. For more political news, breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/thedamagereport. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.